Hey everybody, Miss Cross here, and we are going to begin part 2 of your Andrew Jackson notes today, starting off by just recapping sort of regional differences that are growing during Jackson's presidency. We've been talking about like two major geographic regions, but we're really going to characterize three at this point. So starting with the north, you already know that the northern region geographically is more industrial. Their economic focus is in manufacturing and trade. The North also supports increased or high tariffs. A tariff is a particular tax on foreign made imports to protect American manufacturing. So the North supported those. Also, we've been talking about the agrarian South. The South's economy promoted agriculture and farming, and the South also typically opposed tariffs because it increased the cost of imported goods, and the South is sort of tied to utilizing imports. A lot of farm tools and agricultural products are made overseas, and so increasing those costs were passed on to a lot of Southern farmers frequently. So that's kind of all review. But we see an emerging economy out of the West. Westerners tended to support internal improvements, like they wanted to be connected with the rest of the country. So supported the development of roadways and turnpikes and the use of canals to connect them to the East Coast. And they wanted to ensure the sale of public lands. The Westerners are also a little salty. They had very little tolerance for aristocrats who were typically afraid to get their hands dirty. And so Westerners kind of see themselves as like people who can do it all, and had a lot of judgment for the aristocrats of the East. So we have these three sort of regional differences growing in the 1800s, with very distinct identities. Okay, so we're going to talk about a different topic. Nat Turner's Revolt and the Tennessee Constitution of 1834. They're going to be influenced by one another. So we'll start with Nat Turner's Revolt, sometimes called the Southampton Insurrection. But basically, Nat Turner was an enslaved man in Virginia who had religious visions and claimed at times to have spoken with God. In the year 1831, Nat Turner organizes at least 70 other enslaved people who went and killed over 50 white individuals in Virginia. Uh, in the end, after a few days, the rebellion is put down, and eventually, members of the revolt were captured and executed, uh, including many others who weren't involved. But Turner ends up surviving and hiding for about 2 months, but eventually the rebellion was effectively suppressed by August of 1831. And as a result, all over the South saw increased patrols on plantations and the tightening of slave codes. You should remember that slave codes are the laws passed in the South to keep slaves from gathering or learning to read or write or traveling without expressed permission. But this isn't going to stop future uprisings. So the way that affects Tennessee is that in 1834, just 3 years later, Tennessee is rewriting its state constitution. And like a lot of states at the time, were being influenced by Jacksonian democracy. And Tennessee wants to eliminate its property ownership requirement for men that live in our state to be able to vote. So, under Nat Turner's influence, though, even though voting rights were expanded to white non-property owners, the Tennessee new Constitution 1834 also disenfranchises free African American men. So, to put that in perspective, before 1834, if you were a black property owner, you could have voted. There were some. But after this Constitution, white landowners and white non-property owners could vote, and zero African American men could vote, regardless of whether they owned property. And so, in a way, Tennessee feels the positives of Jacksonian democracy by the expansion of voting rights, as long as you were a white male, because black men were disenfranchised at the same time. The new Tennessee Constitution also created a state Supreme Court, which was a big deal for our judiciary. Another event to discuss is Jackson and the Second Bank of the United States. So we know Jackson hated the National Bank, if you've been following along for the past week and a half. One of my favorite quotes He says about the bank, "You are a den of vipers and thieves. I intend to root you out, and by eternal God, I will root you out." So basically, the Second Bank of the United States was chartered in 1816 with another term limit of 20 years. And, the bank, same role as it always has. It was supposed to be a depository for federal money. It would pay national debts, could make loans, etc. It was only answerable, like meaning it was only had to answer to its directors and its stockholders, which were primarily comprised of industrialists and commercial ventures. They wanted a strong currency and central control of the economy, but opponents, which were usually farmers from the South and West, were distrustful of government banking. So, this is the most famous political cartoon about Andrew Jackson fighting the National Bank. So, I'm just going to kind of read along with me here. In the scene, Jackson is shown fighting a hydra. A hydra is a mythological creature whose heads grow back when they're cut off. You may have seen them in like the animated Hercules or something. The heads of this hydra are portraits of politicians who opposed Jackson's anti-banking policies. So in the little word bubbles there to the right, it says Nicholas Biddle is at the center of the hydra. Why? Well, that's because he is the president of the Second National Bank. Beneath that, it says Andrew Jackson is fighting the Hydra with a cane labeled Veto. Sorry, it's a little grainy and hard to see, but you can barely make out his cane reads Veto. And then it asks you why you think the cartoonist chose this monster to represent the bank. Simply because they were all, the president, there's a lot of support for the bank in Congress. And so eliminating one opponent doesn't necessarily eliminate the institution itself. So Jackson had to fight lots of different people in order to get rid of the bank, but eventually he does. So Jackson has a conflict of interest when it comes to banking because historically he's been critical of banking systems. It says here Jackson had been financially damaged by speculation and tightening of bank credit early in his business career. He distrusted financial institutions for the rest of his life. By 1832, Congressmen Daniel Webster and Henry Clay introduced legislation to recharter the National Bank. Jackson vetoes it. And I know you've seen in the videos on your WebQuest, there's Martin Van Buren visiting Andrew Jackson when he's really sick. And he tells Van Buren, "The bank is trying to kill me, but I will kill it." Jackson orders the federal government's deposits, meaning all of the federal government's money, to be removed from the national bank, and he has it redistributed into different state banks, sometimes called Jackson's pet banks. So he removes all the federal government money, redistributes it, and vetoes and eliminates the national bank. Tariffs. Again, a quick recap on what a tariff is if you look at the illustration at the bottom of the slide. Here it's talking about cloth. British made cloth costing $4, where American cloth costing the same. But when you add a 25% tariff on the British made cloth, it makes the British cloth more expensive to $5 a roll in the United States. So the average consumer is more likely to buy the American made product. And if they buy the British made product, $1 of that money goes to our government and infrastructure improvements. So the year is now 1827. Northern manufacturers are demanding an increased tariff on imported British textiles. A tariff, again, provides protection against foreign competition. But as we know, Southerners oppose tariffs because it hurts their economy, makes their cost go up. So Congress passes what is right before Jeff Jackson's presidency, by the way, in 1827. He hasn't taken office yet. Congress passes this very high tariff on imports. The South calls it the tariff of abominations. I'm going to definition. Abomination is just something that's like really hated. And so the South looks to Jackson's vice president, John C. Calhoun from South Carolina, for leadership and the hopes to like abolish the tariff when he's elected. Now, John C. Calhoun is also famous in my class for another reason. He is the person who invented the neck beard. Take a look at that. Yep, that's his facial hair on his neck. That was in style under his collar. So anyways, the rights of the states are debated amid arguments about this national tariff. So when Jackson takes office, he's forced to deal with the issue. The question is, can an individual state disregard a law passed by Congress? So if Congress passes the tariff law, can a state like South Carolina disregard it or nullify it if they don't like it? So John C. Calhoun there, who is now vice president in Jackson's first term, supports the South and this concept called nullification, where a state can reject or nullify a federal law. You see, Calhoun argues that state power should be greater than federal power because the states formed the federal government. Right or wrong, I don't know how you feel about that principle, but that's the concept of nullification, that a state can nullify or reject a federal law because state power should be greater than federal power since the states had formed the federal government in the first place. So, November 1832, South Carolina passes a nullification law on the tariffs, attempting to nullify the tariff of abominations within their state borders. Andrew Jackson has to send in federal troops to South Carolina to force the state to comply, meaning force South Carolina to obey the tariff law passed by Congress. In the end, Henry Clay, who's from Kentucky, revised a compromise bill, lowers tariffs but doesn't get rid of it, and avoids bloodshed. So Andrew Jackson was a little bit partial, like he agreed the tariffs were too high, but he also can't set a precedent that allows a state to nullify or disregard a federal law, because that's a precedent you don't want to set. Like, you have delegates in Congress who, vote in favor or in opposition to different laws. It's their job to represent their constituency, and that's kind of what they're made to do. So this concept of nullification is going to sort of haunt the United States up until the Civil War. This process of whether a state thinks it can nullify a federal law within its borders based on its constitutionality or whether they agree with it or not. The basis is going to change in the course, but we'll see how that sort of plays out. All right, that's the end of part 2. I hope to do part 3 in person with you guys, but keep your notes, keep them handy. And I'm supposed to end this video by saying, for more riveting American history content, or if you're going to be forced to watch these videos because you or your history teacher at Grassland is quarantined, smash that like button, subscribe, and ring the tiny bell so you don't miss out on future sensational content. I hope I did that right.